Dust billows as Jonas watches them shove Nia into the well. Her scream echoes against the sun-baked stones. He should ride on, but Nia's broken whisper claws at something deep inside him. Help! Jonas knows their cruelty, their casual disregard for her Apache blood, and that they don't expect anyone will interfere. G road that most riders only stopped at when they had no choice. The New Mexico sun sat heavy on the land, pressing dust into every crack of wood and stone. Heat shimmered on the horizon. Jonah's Hale rode in at a slow pace, his limp making the sway in the saddle uneven. He had come for supplies, flour, cartridges, maybe tobacco, and nothing more. He had no ties here, no friends waiting. He rarely stayed in any place longer than it took to fill his pack. At 39, Jonas carried the weight of too many years on the frontier. A former Army scout, he had lived through ambushes, long winters, and nights when the only company was the dead. A scar cut deep across his shoulder where a Comanche lance had caught him years back, and his limb came from a muskball lodged his thigh since the war. People didn't look at him twice anymore. Just another quiet drifter in a dust coat. That was how he liked it. He tied his horse outside the trading post, bought what he needed with few words, and turned back toward the road. The plan was to make camp 2 miles out near a dry wash he'd passed on the way in. He wanted to be gone before the town had reason to notice him. Then he heard it. At first it was faint. So faint he thought it might be the wind pulling through crackboards. A voice. It came again, ragged, carried by air that had nowhere else to go. Jonas froze, hand tightening on the lead rope of his horse. He listened. There was a plea weak and trembling. Help! He followed the sound, boots scuffing through dust until he stood at the edge of the old well on the outskirts of town. Its stones were sun-bleached, the rope and bucket long gone. He leaned over, squinting against the glare. She was down there, a young woman, Apache by her dress, by her features, dark hair tangled against her face, skin scraped raw against the stones. She was crumpled at the bottom, one arm twisted at a wrong angle, her dress torn across the front where the fall had caught her. Sweat clung to her, streaking the dirt on her skin. She looked up when his shadow cut the light, her lips moving again, whispering not to leave her. Jonas's jaw tightened. He knew the townsfolk. He had seen their type before. If she was down there, someone had put her there. He didn't ask why. He didn't shout for others. He knew no one would come. For a moment, he hesitated. He thought about riding on. She wasn't his responsibility. Every time he had stopped before, it had cost him blood, grief, memories that still woke him in the dark. His past was full of voices he hadn't been able to save. But something in the way she struggled to her knees, still trying to stand, even with her arm bent useless, struck hard. He couldn't walk away. Not again. Jonas pulled his rope free from the saddle, tied it firm, and lowered it. His voice carried down, steady, controlled. Take hold. Use your good arm. She blinked up at him as if not sure she could trust a stranger. Fear crossed her face, but there was no choice. She reached, fingers trembling as they closed around the rope. Jonas braced his boots against the stones and hauled back, every muscle tight. The rope creaked, grit toward her palms, and she gasped with each pull. It took time, longer than he wanted. His shoulder burned, his thighs screamed where the old wound pulled, but he didn't stop. Inch by inch she rose, her bare feet scraping stone, her body twisting with pain, where hand finally cleared the rim. Jonas grabbed her wrist and hauled her over, dragging her on his solid ground. She collapsed against him, breathing hard, dress clinging in tatters. Her cleavage showed where the fabric had ripped wide, and she pulled the cloth together quickly, eyes flashing with shame. Jonas didn't look away. He pulled his dust coat from his shoulders and draped it over her, steady and firm, not asking permission. She went still under the weight of it, chest heaving, sweat streaking her temple. Jonas studied her. She was young, maybe 24, no older, bruised across the cheek, arms swelling already. Her eyes, dark and sharp, even through pain, met his with both defiance and something else, relief. He let out a long breath. The question of whether to leave her behind was already gone. He couldn't. Not this time. He hooked an arm under her knees, lifted her carefully despite her WS, and set her across his horse. His own legs burned with the weight, but he ignored it. She was light, too light, as he started leading the horse toward the hills. Jonas's thoughts stayed sharp. He didn't know her name, didn't know the whole story, but he knew enough. She had been left to die, and no one else had answered her voice. That was reason enough for him, and as the town shrank behind them, he felt the old familiar weight of a decision settle in his chest, the kind you couldn't walk back from. Jonas led the horse steadily up the dry trail toward the hills, his boots dragging in the dirt with each uneven step. The woman lay slumped across the saddle, clutching his coat tight around her chest, her injured arm tucked close to her ribs. Her breathing was shallow, every bump in the ground drawing a faint wheezish. The sun had dropped lower, throwing long shadows over the desert floor, and Jonas knew he had only an hour before night closed in. He had no intention of keeping her near the town where she had been thrown into that well. Whatever had been done to her there, it was clear no one would care if she lived or died. He glanced up at her face as he walked, catching her eyes open now, watching him with sharp suspicion. She didn't trust him. He could see it in the way she shifted slightly away, even while she relied on him to keep her steady. That was natural. He was a stranger, a white man, and the very people who had done this to her looked like him. He couldn't expect her to see the difference yet. Jonas's thoughts tightened as he walked. He wondered who exactly had carried out the act. He hadn't seen men near the well, but he could guess. Drunken hands, full of hate and fear, accusing her of theft without proof. It was easier for them to blame an Apache than look at their own. He had seen it before in a dozen towns. Food goes missing, tools turn up gone, and the first brown-skinned face they find is guilty. The rest of the settlement looks away, too busy surviving to risk standing against the crowd. He stopped once to check her arm more closely. The joint was swollen and discolored, twisted at the elbow in a way that made his stomach turn. He thought it might be broken. She tried to pull away when he touched it. Her jaw clenched against pain, but he caught her gaze and spoke low. "It needs binding. You'll lose the use of it if it's left like this." She didn't answer, but she stopped resisting, watching him tie the arm tight against her body with strips of cloth he tore from an old feed sack. His movements were careful, steady, never lingering longer than needed, but he felt the heat of her breath when she turned her face away from him, embarrassed by her own weakness. By the time they reached his camp, the light had thinned into blue and the air had cooled. His camp was nothing more than a fire pit surrounded by stones, a lean-to built from pine branches and a canvas roll on the ground. He had always traveled light. Tonight it would have to serve for two. Jonas lifted her gently from the horse, setting her down near the fire pit. She was too weak to stand on her own, and her good hand clung to his sleeve before she caught herself and let go. Jonas lit the fire quickly, sparks catching dry mesquite twigs until flames spread. Shadows danced across her face, revealing the deep bruise at her temple and the raw scrapes along her collarbone. She kept adjusting the coat around her, making sure the torn fabric underneath was covered. Jonas noticed, but said nothing. He only placed a tin cup of water in her hand and waited until she drank, water spilling against her chin as she forced it down too fast. "Name?" he asked after a long silence, his voice quiet but direct. She hesitated, her dark eyes narrowing. He could see the question forming in her mind. Why should she tell him anything? But after a pause, she answered in a rough voice, "Nia." He nodded once. Jonas. Nothing more needed. He didn't tell her his history, didn't ask hers. Both had scars that were plain enough without explanation. She shifted closer to the fire, the glow warming her skin. Her gaze moved over his rifle, leaning against a rock, his bedroll, the small bundle of supplies. He could almost hear her unspoken questions. Why had he helped? Why hadn't he walked away like the others? He didn't plan to explain. Still, he found himself speaking more than usual. "I heard you." That was enough. Her eyes held his for a moment longer before she looked away, pressing her lips tight. Jonas cooked a small pot of beans and shared half with her, watching carefully as she ate with her good hand. She was hungry enough to finish it all, though her pride kept her movements stiff as though refusing to show need. When the food was gone, She leaned back against the saddle he had set behind her and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed, her body sagging with exhaustion. But she didn't let herself sleep until he settled nearby, rifle across his knees, eyes on the dark ridge. Jonas sat there long after her breathing evened out, thoughts heavy. He knew what this meant. By pulling her from that well, he had tied himself to her fate. The men who had dropped her there would not welcome her survival, and if they discovered he was the one who carried her out, he would be marked with her. He could leave her at first light, ride off before trouble caught him, but his gut told him he wouldn't. He couldn't walk away from her cries today, and he wouldn't be able to tomorrow either. When dawn came, the settlement would whisper, and the men who wanted her gone would stir. Jonas knew this wasn't just about one night of shelter anymore. It was the start of something else, though he wasn't ready to name it. The fire burned low when dawn broke, smoke curling in thin lines above the coals. Jonas had not slept more than a handful of minutes, his back stiff from the ground, rifle still balanced across his lap. He had kept his eyes on the ridge through the night, waiting for movement that never came. The desert was quiet except for coyotes in the distance. When he turned to check on her, Nia was still under his coat, curled near the saddle, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She looked younger in sleep, her face stripped to the sharp suspicion she carried when awake. Jonas stood slowly, testing his leg before putting full weight on it. The limp was worse in the morning, the cold stiffening the old wound. He worked through it, feeding branches into the fire, then walked to the creek bed half a mile down to fill the canteen. He moved quickly, knowing she shouldn't be left alone long. He kept thinking about what would happen if someone from the town followed the tracks. He hadn't seen anyone on the trail the night before, but men with hate in their gut didn't always need much of a reason to come looking. When he returned, she was awake, sitting upright, one hand pulling his coat tight around her. Her eyes tracked him the whole way in, tense until she saw it was him. Jonas noted the look. Fear sharpened into readiness. She was prepared to run or fight even in her state. He respected that. He crouched by the fire, poured water into a tin, and passed it to her. She drank slowly this time, careful not to spill. He noticed her arm again, the swelling worse than the night before. The cloth he had tied held, but it would not last long. He needed a proper splint. "You'll need to keep it still," Jonas said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but steady. "Can't risk a healing wrong." Her gaze didn't leave him. "Why help me?" The words were quiet, but they carried weight. She hadn't asked it the night before, though he had seen the question in her eyes. Now she wanted the truth. Jonas hesitated, shifting his weight. He could have brushed it aside, told her it didn't matter. But she deserved more than silence because I've heard voices before and didn't answer. Couldn't live with that again. He kept his eyes on the fire as he said it. She studied him as though weighing the words, then gave a single nod. No thanks, no softening, but she let the question rest. He worked on a splint, cutting branches to size and binding them with strips from his bedroll. When he touched her arm again, she flinched, biting back a sound. "Hold still," he said, not unkindly, and she did. His hands were steady, practiced from years of tending wounds in the field. When he finished, he saw sweat on her brow, but also relief. She tested the weight of it carefully, then let her shoulders ease. Afterward, he gave her beans from the pot, and this time she ate slower, keeping her eyes on him as if trying to decide what kind of man he was. Jonas said little, focusing on his work. He knew she was studying every move, how he kept his rifle within reach, how he scanned the ridge more than once, how his limp didn't stop him from moving like a man still ready for trouble. When a meal was done, she spoke again, her voice firmer now. "They threw me because corn went missing. I did not take it." Jonas looked at her, meeting her eyes. "I believe you." He meant it. He had seen enough false blame laid at her people's feet to know the truth without proof. She seemed startled at his certainty, as though she expected doubt, even from the man who had pulled her from the well. She lowered her eyes to the fire, but not before he caught the flicker of something. Gratitude, or perhaps relief. The day stretched on, and Jonas tended to his horse, checked his rifle, and set traps near the creek. Nia sat quietly for a long time, then began to move around camp, using her good arm to stack wood and clear stones. He saw the effort it cost her, but he didn't stop her. Work steadied the mind, and he knew she needed to feel something other than helplessness. By late afternoon, the camp looked different. Not much, but enough. A cleared space, a steadier fire, water stored in a pot. She sat down across from him, hair falling loose around her face, and for the first time her eyes softened. "You could have left me there," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Jonas gave a short nod. "I didn't." That night, as the fire burned low again, she shifted closer to its heat. The desert chill had settled in. He laid his blanket wide, motioning once. She hesitated, pride holding her back, then sat beside him. They didn't speak, but when her shoulder brushed his arm, Jonas didn't move away. He stared into the flames, knowing the decision he had made was no small thing. He hadn't meant to take anyone into his life again. Yet here she was, wrapped in his coat, her breathing steady beside him, and he knew there was no turning back. Morning came with a gray sky, the air cooler than the day before. Jonas rose before the fire had gone out, feeding it with dry wood until flames caught again. He moved slow, his limp more pronounced after sleeping on the ground, but he kept his steps steady. When he turned back, Nia was already awake, sitting upright, the coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She had not slept deeply. He could tell by the tightness around her eyes. She tried to stand, bracing herself on her good arm. Jonas saw it before it happened. Her legs buckled, her balance gone. He stepped forward quickly, catching her under the arms before she hit the ground. Her body tensed at his grip, pride stiffening her back, but she didn't push him away. She was too weak. Jonas lowered her onto a flat stone near the fire, his expression calm, though inside he felt the knot of worry tighten. "You shouldn't push yet," he said. His tone was firm, but even. She kept her eyes fixed on the fire, jaw set, breathing sharp through her nose. He recognized it, pride cut by humiliation. He had felt it himself too many times after the muskball in his thigh left him limping for life. He crouched down beside her, speaking quieter. "Your body needs time. Walking now will break you worse." She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked toward him. He saw in them the fight, her refusal to be helpless, her fear of depending on a man she barely knew. To ease the weight of silence, Jonas set about boiling water in the tin, dropping in strips of dried venison. The smell rose slow, filling the camp with something solid. He placed the cup in her hand when it was ready. "Drink. It'll keep you steady." While she drank, Jonas thought of the town again. He knew listeners might ask, why hadn't the sheriff been told? Why hadn't anyone stopped those men from throwing her down the well? He had his answer ready because he had seen it too often. The law in towns like that served the loudest voices, not the quiet ones. The sheriff, if he knew it all, would look the other way. To them, an Apache woman was no more than trouble, an easy scapegoat when grain went missing. That was why Jonas hadn't carried her back. He didn't need to test it. He already knew. After the meal, he began checking the traps he had set the day before. Nia tried to rise again, slower this time. Jonas watched from the corner of his eye, not moving to stop her. She took 3 careful steps, swaying but holding upright, her good arm gripping a branch she had found for balance. She stood there a long moment, breathing hard, then lowered herself back to sit. Jonas returned with a rabbit from the traps, setting it down near the fire without comment. Her small effort to walk had told him what he needed. She wasn't giving up. While he skinned the rabbit, she finally spoke. "They said I stole corn," she muttered, her voice flat. She looked down at her hands as she spoke. "I went to the storeroom to ask for scraps. They refused. That night sacks were torn. They blamed me." She raised her eyes then, locking on his. "I took nothing." Jonas held her stare, knife still in his hand. "I told you already. I believe you." His tone didn't waver. She searched his face as if testing for a crack, some sign of doubt. She found none. She looked away quickly, but he caught the faint shift in her shoulders, the smallest easing of tension. As the day warmed, Jonas showed her how to keep the splint steady, how to hold her arm against her side when she walked. She listened, eyes following every move. At midday, when he poured water over the cloth to cool the swelling, his fingers brushed against her skin. She flinched at the touch, not from pain, but from something else. He didn't pull back, only steadied the cloth and tied it tighter. Her breathing caught, then smooth. By evening, the camp carried a new rhythm. She fetched wood with her good hand, awkward but determined. While Jonas cooked, he caught her glancing at him now and then, studying the scar on his cheek, the limp when he shifted weight, the quiet way he moved. She was measuring him, he realized, deciding if he was truly different from the man who had left her to die. When the fire dimmed that night, the cold pressed in again. Jonas laid out his blanket as before. She hesitated longer this time, pride fighting need, but finally lowered herself onto the blanket beside him. Her shoulder brushed his arm once more. Neither moved away. She pulled the coat tighter, and Jonas kept his eyes on the fire, though he felt the warmth of her leaning close. He knew what listeners would wonder. Would he leave her when she could stand? When her strength returned, the thought crossed his mind too. But he felt the answers settle in him with more certainty than he liked. He had carried her from the well. He had bound her wounds. And now, sitting shoulder to shoulder in silence, he knew leaving was no longer a choice he would make. The next morning broke clear. The sky washed pale blue as the desert cooled from the night. Jonas stirred the fire back to life with practiced movements, his shoulders rolling stiff from sleep. He had gotten used to waking to nothing but silence. But now there was another sound, her steady breathing, a faint cough, the rustle of cloth as she shifted beneath his coat. Nia sat up slowly, her hair tangled and dark around her face, her injured arm cradled close. She tried to push it from her mind, but he could see the tension cut across her brow. Jonas passed her a tin cup of water, then bread softened in the broth from last night's rabbit. She ate carefully, trying to use both hands out of habit before realizing again that she could not. He noticed the flicker of frustration, the set of her jaw as she forced herself to continue with only her good hand, to ease her pride. He didn't comment, just cut his own bread one-handed, showing her it could be done without shame. She caught him doing it, her eyes narrowing, but she said nothing. When a meal was done, she stood again, steadier than the day before, though her steps were slow. Jonas followed her movements with a careful eye. She went to the creek, filled the pot, and carried it back against her hip. The water slashed, wetting her dress, but she did not falter. Jonas felt something shift watching her, the way she fought against her weakness, the way she refused to stay seated when her body begged her to. Later, while he mended the strap of his saddle, she came to sit across from him, her gaze fixed on his hands, rough and scarred, threading leather with precise motions. After a long silence, she spoke. "You were soldier." He paused, then gave a slow nod. "Scout, Army years back." His voice was flat, not inviting questions, but her eyes pressed for more. "You kill?" she asked quietly, not with accusation, but with blunt curiosity. Jonas tightened the strap and looked at her directly. "Yes, too many." The words came out low, heavy with memory. She didn't look away, only studied him with the same steady gaze she had held at the fire. Then she nodded once, as if the answer explained something she had already suspected. She did not ask again. She reached for his sleeve, suddenly holding the edge where it had torn near the shoulder. With her good hand, she pulled a needle and thread from the small pouch at her waist. He hadn't noticed it before, tucked beneath the folds of her dress. Slowly, awkwardly, with one arm she began stitching. Her fingers trembled, her motions uneven, but she worked until the cloth held. Jonas sat still, watching her concentration, the way she pressed her lip between her teeth as she pulled the thread tight. When she finished, she handed it back without a word. "Good work," Jonas said quietly, genuine. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away, but he caught the faint lift in her expression, small pride breaking through the exhaustion. Through the afternoon, they worked side by side without planning it. Jonas set new traps. She gathered mesquite pods for the fire. He cleaned his rifle. She washed the cooking tin at the creek. Their movements fit together in rhythm, not through talk, but through watching and responding. Each time she struggled with her arm, Jonas moved as if to help, but she shook her head, forcing herself to finish. He led her, understanding she needed to hold on to what strength she had left. That evening, as the fire burned strong, Nia shifted closer than before, her shoulder nearly against his. She hesitated, then placed her hand lightly on his. Her skin was warm, the touch brief at first, then steady. Jonas didn't move away. He turned his hands so their palms met, fingers resting against hers. The silence between them carried more than words could. She leaned against him after, her head resting against his chest. For the first time, Jonas allowed himself to breathe deep, feeling the weight of another person pressed to him, not in battle, not in grief, but in quiet trust. His mind flicked back to the well, to the moment he had almost walked away. He knew now he never could have. As the night settled and her breathing slowed against him, Jonas realized the camp no longer felt like a place for just one man. Her presence had changed it, and though no promises had been spoken, he felt the truth settle heavy and certain. He had tied his life to hers the moment he pulled her from the dark. The night stretched long, the fire burning down to embers, the desert wind carrying grit across the camp. Jonas lay with his back to the saddle, Nia leaning against him, her breathing light and steady. He had grown used to silence, but this was different, the kind that carried warmth instead of emptiness. For years he had known only the weight of his own thoughts, the echo of old battles, the names of men long gone. Now there was another heartbeat close to his, another presence filling the space that had been hollow for too long. When dawn came, the world was hushed, the sky washed pale gold. Jonas rose quietly, not to wake her, and stoked the fire until it caught again. He boiled water for coffee, the bitter smell filling the camp. He glanced back at her as she stirred awake, eyes opening slow, weary at first before softening when they settled on him. For the first time, he saw something in her gaze that wasn't just suspicion or guarded pride. It was trust, tentative, but real. She shifted, trying to move her splendid arm. A hiss of pain escaped before she caught it. Jonas crouched beside her, checking the cloth. "Swelling's gone down some," he said. "Steady as always. You'll have use of it again in time." She studied him, her voice quiet. "You know how to heal." "Had to learn," he answered. "Army didn't send doctors into the field. We patched each other up, or we died." His words were plain, but she heard the edge beneath them. The years of watching too many not make it. She didn't press him, but her eyes lingered as if weighing the cost he carried. That day, the rhythm of work began again. Jonas checked the traps, skinned another rabbit. Nia insisted on helping more, gathering wood, grinding beans with her good hand. She moved slow, but he let her. Every small task she managed seemed to give her strength. At one point, she stumbled, carrying water back from the creek, nearly dropping the pot. Jonas caught it with one hand before it spilled, steadying her with the other. She froze in his grip, their faces close, her breath sharp against his chin. Neither moved for a moment. Then she stepped back, her cheeks flushed, clutching the coat tighter around her. Jonas let her go without a word, but the moment stayed. By evening, the air cooled again, the sky stree. Jonas sharpened his knife while she sat across from him, sewing another tear in his coat. She worked slow, her head bent, hair falling across her cheek. He watched her longer than he should have, until she lifted her eyes and caught him. For the first time, she didn't look away. When the fire burned low, she shifted beside him again, closer than the nights before. Their shoulders touched, and after a moment, she turned, her face near his. Jonas felt her hand brush against his chest, light but deliberate. His breath caught, though he held his composure. Her eyes searched his, asking without words if she was safe to cross this line. Jonas, scarred by years of silence, found himself answering not with speech, but with action. He lowered his head, his lips meeting hers. The kiss was cautious at first, the firelight casting their faces in sharp glow. She pressed into him, her good hand resting against his jaw. Jonas held her carefully, steadying her, as though afraid she might break. When they parted, her forehead rested against his, her breath quick, her eyes closed. For the first time since he had pulled her from the well, he saw her without fear. Jonas sat back slowly, his voice low, the words rough. "I won't take what's not freely given." She opened her eyes then, meeting his with a clarity that cut through the night. "I stay because I choose," she whispered. Her words were heavy with meaning, and Jonas felt them settle deep, heavier than any vow. That night they shared the blanket without hesitation. She curled against him, his arm careful around her waist. The campfire burned slow, the desert quiet beyond, and for the first time in years, Jonas let himself rest without one eye open. The presence beside him no longer a burden, but a promise. The next morning broke with a sharp wind pushing dust across the camp. Jonas rose early, moving quietly to check the traps near the creek. His body felt lighter than it had in months, though he would never admit it aloud. When he returned, Nia was tending the fire, her good hand steady as she stirred a pot of beans. She looked up when she heard his steps, and for the first time, she didn't tense, as if expecting trouble. That change alone told him how far they had come. But peace never lasted long in places like this. By midday, Jonas knew they couldn't stay hidden in the hills forever. He needed ammunition, flour, salt, supplies that would force him back into town. Nia saw it too. "You go back," she said quietly as they ate. "They will see me with you. They will hate it." Her voice was flat, but beneath it lay fear, though she tried to hide it. Jonas met her gaze across the fire. "If I go back, I won't leave you here alone, and I won't hide you." His tone was calm, but final. He had already made his choice. She looked away, chewing slowly, but he caught the flicker in her eyes. Part worry, part something else he couldn't name. By afternoon, Jonas saddled the horse and helped her up carefully, her injured arm cradled against her side. They rode down toward the settlement, the dry road stretching into view. Nia's body tensed as the first buildings came into sight, the memory of being dragged to the well still too fresh. Jonas kept his hand near the rifle slung across his back, his jaw set. When they reached the trading post, the voices fell quiet. Men standing outside shifted, their eyes cutting toward Nia, then toward Jonas. One spat into the dust. Another muttered something about witch blood. Jonas ignored them, tying the horse and leading her inside. He bought flour, cartridges, and coffee without haggling, his tone short but steady. Nia stayed close, her eyes low, but her posture straight. When they stepped out, 3 men blocked the way, faces he recognized from the well's edge the night he found her. Their expressions were tight, mouths curled in contempt. The tallest stepped forward, his hand resting near the grip of his revolver. "You took what wasn't yours," he said, nodding toward Nia. "Best turn her loose before more trouble comes." Jonas felt the old heat rise in his chest, the kind he had fought to bury. He shifted slightly, bringing his stance square, his limp hidden by the weight of his posture. His voice carried low but sharp. "I pulled her from the well because leaving her, there was murder. She stays with me now. Anyone with a quarrel can speak a plain." The street went silent. The man's eyes flicked to Jonas's rifle, then to the cold steadiness in his face. For a moment, tension tightened like a drawn bow. Then the man spat again and stepped back. The others followed, muttering under their breath, but not drawing steel. Jonas didn't move until they turned away. Nia's hand gripped his coat tightly as they mounted the horse again, her eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't need her to speak to know what she felt. Shame from being accused, fear of what might still come. He covered her hand briefly with his own, grounding her without words. They rode back into the hills without incident, but Jonas knew the matter wasn't settled. The men hadn't forgotten. The town would whisper louder now, and eyes would follow. He also knew listeners might wonder why didn't Jonas take her further away from the settlement altogether. The truth was simple. His supplies, his work, his known ground were here. Moving further meant starting from nothing again. And more than that, he wasn't running anymore. He had made his choice the moment he pulled her from the well. Back at camp, Nia sat quiet for a long time, staring at the fire. Finally, she lifted her eyes. "You risked your life," she said softly. Her tone wasn't accusation. It carried confusion, maybe gratitude. Jonas held her gaze, answering with the only truth he had. "I don't walk away, not from you." That night she shifted closer under the blanket, her body pressed against his without hesitation. Her breathing steadied as she leaned into him, and Jonas felt the weight of what had begun. No longer a choice made in the heat of a moment, but a bond tested against the judgment of others. He knew trouble would come again, but he also knew he wouldn't face it alone. The night after their return from town was restless. Jonas sat awake longer than usual, the firelight cutting across his face as Nia slept beside him, her head resting against his chest. He listened to every sound, The crack of branches in the distance, the cry of a coyote, the faint whistle of the wind. The encounter at the trading post hadn't ended the matter. He knew those men. Their kind didn't forget. Sooner or later they would test his resolve. That thought stayed with him, but so did the memory of her hand gripping his coat in front of the whole town, refusing to let go. At dawn, Nia stirred first, wincing as she shifted her arm. The swelling had begun to ease, but she still carried the weight of pain. Jonas helped her rewrap the splint, his hands steady and deliberate. She watched him closely, her expression caught somewhere between gratitude and discomfort. He spoke quietly as he worked, not often one for words, but knowing she needed them. "It's healing. You'll have your strength back in time." She gave a small nod, her lips pressed tight. Listeners might wonder what Nia truly wanted in this arrangement. Was she staying because she had no choice, or because trust was forming? The answer became clearer that morning when she asked unprompted, "Why do you live alone?" Her voice carried genuine curiosity, not just suspicion. Jonas paused, the question cutting deeper than he expected. He had avoided saying it aloud for years. He met her eyes and answered with plain truth. "Because I buried everyone I cared for. Wife, child, or took the rest. Easier to keep to myself than to watch more die." His words came out raw, stripped of anything but fact. Nia looked at him a long time. "You saved me," she said softly. "So maybe not easier anymore." Her words weren't meant as comfort. They were simple, direct, but they lodged in him deeper than anything had in years. That afternoon, rain clouds gathered over the ridges, heavy and low. Jonas pulled canvas across the lean-to, while Nia gathered stones to steady the fire. They worked side by side, their movement smooth, no need for orders. When the rain broke, they sheltered together, the sound of drops striking hard against canvas. Nia sat close, the damp air curling strands of her hair against her cheek. Jonas reached up without thinking, brushing one away. She didn't flinch. The storm pressed them tighter. Her hand found his resting there, her fingers curling slowly around his rough palm. The quiet stretched long, filled only by the rush of rain. When she leaned toward him, Jonas met her halfway, their lips meeting in the half-light. This time there was no hesitation. The kiss was firm, searching, and when she pulled back, her eyes held his with certainty. "I'm not afraid when I am with you," she whispered. He drew her against him, his arms steady at her waist, careful of her injury. They stayed like that until the storm passed, the air cooling, the desert washed clean outside. As night came, the fire burned strong again. Nas sat close, her body pressed into his side. She spoke in fragments about her people, how raids had scattered them, how hunger had driven her toward the town that betrayed her. Jonas listened, not pressing for details, only offering his presence. When she faltered, he rested his hand lightly over hers, grounding her. That night, under the blanket they now shared without question, their closeness deepened. The space between them no longer carried suspicion or pride, but choice. Her hand traced the scar at his chest, her breath warm against his neck. He held her carefully with a restraint born not of doubt, but of respect. Every movement was deliberate, every touch an unspoken promise. For years, Jonas had thought himself hollow, surviving only because his body refused to quit. Now with her pressed against him, he felt the weight of something new. Responsibility, yes, but also belonging. The storm outside had passed, but he knew the one beyond their camp still waited. And when it came, he was ready to meet it, not alone. The morning after the storm was crisp, the desert air washed clean, the sky stretched wide and pale. Jonas rose early, his movements deliberate as he checked the traps and saddled the horse. He felt something shift inside him, a quiet certainty that the time for hiding had passed. Nia sat near the fire, wrapping his coat tighter around her frame. She watched him closely, reading his intent before he spoke. "They won't leave this alone," Jonas said evenly as he crouched near the fire. "Men like that don't forget. If they see you alive with me, they'll push harder." He didn't raise his voice. It wasn't a threat, just a fact. Nia's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. Then we faced them. Her words were quiet but steady. For a woman who had been left to die in a well, it carried weight. Jonas studied for a moment, then gave a single nod. By midday, they rode back toward the town, dust rising behind the horses' hooves. Jonas carried his rifle slung but ready, his revolver heavy at his side. Nia rode in front, wrapped in his coat, her back straight despite the stiffness in her arm. Heads turned as they entered the main road. Whispers followed. The Apache woman alive. The quiet scout bringing her in plain sight. The same three men who had blocked them before stood outside the saloon. Their eyes narrowed when they saw her. One step forward, spitting into the dust. "We told you to turn her loose." Jonas dismounted slow and measured, his limp, not hiding the steadiness in his stance. His voice cut through the silence. "She stays with me. You try to take her again, you answer to me." The man's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Jonas was faster. His revolver cleared the holster before the other's fingers touched leather. The street froze. Jonas's voice stayed level, the barrel of his gun aimed without a shake. "You've already shown what kind of men you are. Leave her be or next time I won't stop at words." The moment stretched long, the crowd watching, no one daring to move. Finally, the man's eyes faltered. He stepped back, muttering curses but not drawing steel. The others followed, their bravado broken under the weight of Jonas's gaze. The town slowly resumed its noise, but the point had been made. Jonas holstered his revolver, then offered his hand to Nia as she slid down from the saddle. She gripped him steady, her eyes holding his. In that look, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that what had been survival was now choice. They finished their business quickly, buying what they needed, ignoring the stares. When they left town, no one stopped them. The road back to the hills felt different, freer, as though the weight of others' judgment had been pushed aside. Back at camp, Jonas began to build more than just a fire. He cut logs, stacking them carefully. Nia watched, puzzled, until he spoke. "This place was meant for passing through, but I'm done drifting." He paused, glancing at her. "I wanted to be ours." Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. She walked to him, her hand resting over his on the log. "You saved me from the well," she said quietly. "Now you give me a place." Jonas nodded once, his voice rough. Not just a place, a life. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridges, they sat together near the fire, their shoulders touching, her head against his chest. There were no crowds, no whispers, no men waiting to strike. Only the steady rhythm of two people who had chosen to stay. For Jonas, it was the first time in years the silence felt whole instead of empty. For Nia, it was the first time she belonged without fear. The well had been meant to bury her, but instead it had tied their lives together. When the fire burned low, Jonas reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple leather band he had carved in the days before. He slipped it gently onto her finger. "You're mine if you want it that way." Her answer came not with words, but with the firm press of her lips against his. She stayed there, her breath warm against him, her hand tight in his. The desert stretched wide around them, but the hollow spaces inside were gone. For the first time, neither of them had to walk alone.